Breaking tonight, just days after announcing new military efforts to head off the terror group in Iraq, President Obama is defending his decisions, saying that he is not the one who made the call to pull all of the troops out of Iraq, and adding that claims suggest otherwise are, quote, bogus and wrong. The Washington Free Beacon newspaper today put together this to look at that question. Now you take a look.
For the first time in 9 years, there are no Americans fighting in Iraq. 4 years ago, I promised to end the war in Iraq. We did. 4 years ago, I promised to end the war in Iraq. I did. 4 years ago, I promised to end the war in Iraq, and I did. I told you we'd end the war in Iraq. We did. I said we'd end the Iraq war. We did. I told you I'd end the war in Iraq, and we did. I ended the war in Iraq as I promised. In 2008, I promised we'd end the war in Iraq. We've ended it. I was able to keep my promise and end the war in Iraq. In 2008, I promised we would end the war in Iraq, and we've ended it. The war in Iraq is over. The war in Iraq is over from ending the war in Iraq. That's why I ended the war in Iraq. For the first time in 9 years, there are no Americans fighting in Iraq.
President, do you have any second thoughts about pulling all ground troops out of Iraq?
You know what I just find interesting is the degree to which this issue keeps on coming up, as if this was my decision.
How about that? Mark Hanna is a Democratic campaign veteran who worked on the Kerry and Obama presidential campaigns. Steve Hayes is senior writer for the Weekly Standard and a Fox News contributor. Gentlemen, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Martha.
Mark, let me start with you. How do you react to that?
You're asking me. Look, yeah, President Obama was very clear that this is something he campaigned on, and it's a promise he kept. When he says it's not a decision he made, I think what the point he's trying to make is he didn't make it alone. The American people made the decision to end the war in Iraq when they elected him, and they made the decision even going back in 2006 when they dealt a blow in the midterm election and voted into Congress a lot of people who were opposed to keeping American presence in Iraq. So let's not forget that the American public opinion was vastly on the side of winding down that war. We had spent $2 trillion in taxpayer money. We had spent over about 4,500 American lives. And we didn't see something in our national security interests or in our strategic interests. And also, Prime Minister al-Maliki also wanted the war to be over because he wouldn't sign a status of forces.
There's some issues with regard to our national security interests that are there now. And the big issue that's on the table, Steve Hayes, is that you can't, obviously, you can't end a war just because you want it to be over, because it appears now that it's not over.
Right. I think that's the big problem President Obama faces now. And look, give Mark creativity points. I mean, that was pretty good. For somebody who does spin for a living, I think that was about as good an answer as the president could hope to get from somebody defending him. The reality is, as the Washington Free Beacon video makes clear, as President Obama's speech on October 21st, 2011, announcing the withdrawal of all troops makes clear, it was his decision. He decided to end the war in Iraq. He decided that we weren't going to be fighting anymore. He campaigned on it repeatedly. He cast aside questions from people, whether they were his political rivals, whether they were intelligence officials, wondering about whether the security implications would be too costly for the United States. Right. That's a problem. He's got to face up to those consequences.
Understood. Steve,
go ahead, Mark.
I'd just like to know from Steve, because, you know, even conservative commentators, for example, Byron York in the Washington Examiner, who's no fan of the president, said that if, in order to even prevent this insurgency, we would have had to have 100,000 troops still in Iraq. And, you know, I just want to know from Steve, how many troops does he want to keep in the country, and how many more years does he want to keep them there? And should we have kept them there without a status of forces agreement, which al-Maliki wasn't about to sign anyway?
By many accounts, it was possible to reach a status of forces agreement if we had pushed for it. Steve, you want to answer Mark's question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I don't know where Byron's coming up with the numbers of 100,000 troops, but and look, I don't agree with conservatives who say that Iraq was on a glide path to success, to democracy when President Obama came into office. I think there was hard work to be done when President Obama came into office, and I think the criticism of President Obama that I would make is that he just didn't do the hard work. Now, he campaigned on that. You're right to point that out, but there was a heavy lift there, and I think having a U.S. troop presence there could have kept Nouri al-Maliki from doing the kinds of things, from exacting the kinds of revenge that he did on the Sunnis, from firing Sunni generals, and could have helped Iraqis cultivate the habits of democracy that they needed to make this successful. But there's no question. You can go back and look in February 2009, the reports in places like the New York Times, not necessarily friendly to George W. Bush, that argued that Iraq was in a pretty good spot, that it was far more secure than it had been, and that there was a chance for success.
Yeah. All right, we got to go, gentlemen. Mark, thank you very much. Steve, always good to have you as well.
Thanks, Martha.
Thanks, Martha.